When you think of the word sustainable, what comes to mind? Maybe you've heard it tossed around in conversations of environmental concerns, climate change, overconsumption, or minimalism. But no matter what industry or what place you've heard or encountered it in, the role of sustainability in our everyday lives has drastically increased. As we transition from vague, untargeted talks around sustainability to ones with concrete frameworks, we ought to explore the definition of and attitudes towards sustainability more deeply to dial our goals and plans of action. Hi, my name is Claire, and in this podcast episode, I'll be talking about some of the shifting understandings of sustainability. More specifically, I'll be talking about the use of traditional ecological knowledge and Western knowledge in natural resource management. Now, why is this topic important? Well, it's no secret that natural resources have been inextricably related to Canada's economy. For here in Alberta, think of oil and gas. For Ontario or BC, maybe think logging and forestry. On the East Coast, maybe those fisheries. And up north, how about mining? But behind these lucrative industries is something maybe a bit more sinister, or at the very least, problematic. While these industries have bolstered the national economy for sure and contributed to Canada's national identity, they have all had their fair shares of controversies when it comes to how they've gone about their operations. In this case, I'm speaking to the headlines about halted oil and gas pipeline projects, the protection of old-growth forests, mining conflicts, and fishing riots or disputes. Now, it's important to remember that these aren't just headlines. They are and have been exhausting realities for Indigenous peoples. And for that matter, we have to have conversations about where we go from here. What now? What ought to happen to allow for space for better relations with Indigenous peoples? The time is now. With the result of recent discussions related to recommendations set out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, and through new legislation like the Federal Impact Assessment Act, there's no time like the present to take this time to re-examine what the natural resource industry can look like in the age of sustainability talks combined with reconciliation. I mean, it's been 7 years since the TRC, and only 13 of the 94 calls to action have been completed. I think we can do better. First in this conversation, we have to talk about what sustainability is. The concept of sustainability has admittedly had a number of definitions, but here is one that I have found as fairly all-encompassing and accurate. It goes like this. Sustainably is the use of environment and resources to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Seems pretty reasonable, eh? Right, so sustainability is basically talking about the long-term viability of something. Can it stand the test of time? Can it withstand external or internal stressors and pressures? How resilient is a system to change? We also know that sustainability can be applied to other areas through the commonly named pillars of sustainability such as social, economic, environmental, and cultural. In applying all these pillars, we can later see the important synergies between them and how the sustainability of one pillar may affect another. Now let's move on to the modes of thinking I briefly mentioned earlier, Western scientific knowledge and Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. Western scientific knowledge is basically just the stuff that is taught at schools these days, whereas traditional ecological knowledge is arguably a little less mainstream and is defined as the cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission and about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and their environment. It truly captures the idea that we, as humans, are connected to everything. With this definition, we can see how traditional ecological knowledge is a bit different, given that it is more abstract, qualitative, inclusive, intuitive, and diachronic in both practice and application. We can see evidence of the effects of historical unsustainable decisions made on behalf of Indigenous peoples through statistics like the over-incarceration rates of Indigenous peoples, high rates of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, high rates of poverty and food insecurity compared to other population groups, and ongoing issues with access to proper housing and water. The list could go on. Today, what this difference in knowledge bases and methods has caused is the habitual exclusion of Indigenous knowledge from the field of things like natural resource management. This ignorance towards the robust knowledge base built over years by Indigenous peoples has not only led to knowledge gaps in the field, but also decisions that are not sustainable for Indigenous people. From this, we can see how this conversation relates to multiple pillars of sustainability, specifically environmental and cultural, when talking about natural resource management in Canada. With Indigenous knowledge bases, we know that the land and all its beings is incredibly fundamental to community engagement, well being, and cultural endurance. Over the years, we've seen how extractive industries have displaced and fragmented this relationship. Western knowledge has seen humans as separate from nature in many ways. We saw this in the development of our national parks, for example. Environmental theorists and writers at the time, like Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, and William Wordsworth, really pushed this narrative that romanticized nature. They framed it as sort of an escape from the flaws of humanity and an untouched paradise that one could experience the supernatural. In doing so, these writings and their influence on the formation of national parks thereafter omitted other experiences and perspectives, such as Indigenous ones, to how humans relate to nature. With this in mind, we have to look into how this has shielded many of our views of what sustainability means if we keep our siloed modes of thinking. In relation to this topic, there's one scholar that stands out to me, and that is Dr. Jeff Corntassel. Now, Dr. Corntassel is an Indigenous political legal scholar at the University of Victoria and has written extensively on reconciliation and self-determination. One framework that he has written is called sustainable self-determination. Like any framework, he came up with it to address an urgent need for change. He identified four main problems with self-determination efforts today. The first was that it is a rights-based discourse which separates land and natural resource access from political and legal recognition or autonomy. In other words, it sees them as two separate topics of discussion, rather than interrelated issues from having sustainable livelihoods for all Indigenous people. The second issue he identifies is the denial of identity within borders. With this point, he is talking about how Indigenous people are sometimes put into various minority groups or categories that distract or even take away from the legally weighted classification of Indigenous. When this is done, the state or whoever is in charge can sort of revoke some of their legal responsibilities they have towards Indigenous people. Third, Corntassel sees a current problem of rights being seen as political or legal entitlements, which is a Eurocentric mode of thinking that negates the importance of Indigenous cultural responsibilities and relationships to their families and the natural world. Finally, he asserts that the ad hoc solutions and restrictions currently used in industry and politics are ineffective because there is little to no long-term foresight in the planning and implementation of these policies, and therefore limits lasting, effective decolonization and restoration frameworks. To all these issues, Corntassel presents the concept of sustainable self-determination, which attempts to recognize the current contemporary challenges for Indigenous people in politics and resource management, and comes up with a viable framework towards a solution. Corntassel proposes that the process of Indigenous self-determination is more than a political and legal struggle. At its core are spiritual and relational relationships that are continuously renewed. His framework therefore calls for any plans towards self-determination as needing to be economically, environmentally, and culturally viable, while also being properly linked to Indigenous relationships with the natural world, both spiritually and relationally. Obviously, Western knowledge is not going by the wayside anytime soon, or at all, frankly. But in order for something like sustainable self-determination to work, there has to be more integration of Indigenous knowledge bases too. This is so that decisions can take into account things like I talked about earlier, like the importance of human and nature relationships and reciprocity. In many ways, this is what sustainability needs to include from an Indigenous perspective. Within this, the sustainable option might be co-management, and not just using both knowledges or listening to them and then choosing one or the other. It means actually integrating them together and seeing them as complementary to another. This is kind of reflective of two-eyed seeing, which was coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall in 2004. You can check it out just by Googling it. It's actually pretty cool to look at. Indeed, there have been many cases in the past where traditional ecological knowledge has been able to fill in the gaps that Western science has not been able to account for. For example, in 2008, there was a study done by scholars Anne Kendrick and Micheline Manso that looked at barren ground caribou and saw just how useful both knowledge bases can be for one another. In this study, Indigenous knowledge helped map out remote caribou movement, behavior, and appearance, and Western knowledge helped track empirical data from the caribou population. Another project that is useful to look at is the Cooperatively Managed Fisheries Joint Management Committee, which combines the expertise of both Inuit and non-Indigenous people. This committee is quite involved in the regulation of animals harvested, such as beluga whales. For the people in this area, beluga whales have served as an integral aspect of their culture, tradition, and sustenance activities. One notable project that was overseen by this committee was when they worked to establish general standards for conservation, protection, tourism, hunting, and the general management of the species population. Unsurprisingly, the committee noted the need for scientific research to be done to inform such decisions. Within the study, the value of Indigenous knowledge was proven, given that the researchers completely miscalculated actual population counts of beluga whales. Indigenous hunters and harvesters in the area had monitored, observed, and interacted with the population over the course of generations and cited quite high population counts. Their population count was around 40,000 beluga whales because they were able to underscore the importance of counting whales under the water and beyond the monitored water boundary, whereas Western scientific researchers claimed population counts to be a mere 7,000, which resulted in unnecessary restrictive quotas. It's projects like these that demonstrate a greater ability to tackle complex questions of environmental sustainability with the most comprehensive, up-to-date data while also engaging multiple stakeholders as equal knowledge sharers to solution building. It also goes to show how these different knowledge bases produce different expected goals and outcomes for management strategies. This can be incredibly important to ensuring everybody is on board and feels equally satisfied with any sustainability plan. I mean, this is all key to creating a future where we figure out best practices towards creating industry spaces that are grounded in mutual understanding, proper negotiation, and partnership, where Indigenous rights and self-determination are able to simultaneously operate within and along with industry goals. When this happens, this is sustainable. Our plans are really only as good as people following them, and we know that people are more likely to follow them if they're part of the conversation that made them. Anyways, I close with these thoughts. Sustainability is now. Sustainability is a future must. Likewise, reconciliation and making up for Canada's sordid history and ongoing injustices is essential. Co-management strategies allow for opportunities to disrupt this solely colonial system of management and may allow for Indigenous visions of the future to come to light and lead to cultural sustainability in conjunction with much-needed environmental sustainability. Co-management allows for the direct collaboration among stakeholders, which is a crucial step towards collective engagement, understanding, and communication. We know that climate change is a wicked problem, and it will require all hands on deck. And co-management strategies that use traditional ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge as a braided solution is a way that we can arguably put our best foot forward towards a sustainable future. We can see how co-management, in particular, allows for the realization that there are similarities in scientific methods and data tracking, which we can use to our advantage. We must also remember that Indigenous science is science. We know that science attempts to make sense of the world, and Indigenous knowledge has done just that since time immemorial. Indigenous knowledge has also accounted for the ways in which humans are connected with the ecological dimension and has cited our responsibilities because of that. Nevertheless, we ought to remember that just because something is a challenge, hard, or different from the status quo doesn't mean that it's not worth trying for or working towards. Because if we don't change today, there may not be a Canada left for future generations to enjoy. The notion of sustainability can obviously take on many definitions, but how we are going about it today is certainly not it. It's time for us to take a different path. The time starts now. It starts today.